Finally, finally, it seems that all the fighting from the other side is calming down. Although all I keep hearing is how this the calm before the storm. Unfortunately, that is all I can understand most of what they say, this being due to them constantly changing languages when they speak. From the guardian and her sister, this is normal, but it's difficult for me to understand what in the hell they're saying. It isn't the fact that they're changing at random, but instead the words in common use, for them, can come from any language ever used. Apparently, this is why it's so difficult to correctly summon a demon. You have to use words that are in common use. You can't use slang or anything that can be misconstrued. And then you can simply use the root language if you got it down. However, you do have to be able to pronounce the words correctly. Thankfully, I have two that in my house that can teach me. Since it is springtime, it is nice to have an extra set of hands to help me with a garden and other spring cleaning. At least it would if a certain hot toddy would ever get off her ass once in a while. Though as soon as I can get her outside, the neighbor kids show up in even bigger and bigger groups. Now I'm used to folks walking down the street and slow down when my guardian is outside. Also, the boys for the next half a mile any direction would make it a point to be around just in time to see her in those sparse outfits she wears. Now, oh boy, I've got two stunning women washing my car and truck, wearing barely anything to cover the most important areas. You can also guess what happens when they get bored and start spraying each other with the hose. If the entire situation wasn't so funny, watching the local kids practically juice themselves at the sight, I would have put a stop to it. The weird weather has me wondering what's going on. Though it's warming up, these cold snaps have made it impossible to get crops in the ground. I've also lost another one of my beehives. When I went to check on the remaining hives, I felt something cold rub against my neck. I know that feeling. Looking around, I couldn't see a wisp of air, but I knew she was there. I looked into the woods for a green glow, but there wasn't anything there either, not that I could see. Opening my suit, I reached in for my pistol, and that's when I felt a hand on my arm. The hand was placed on my forearm as I reached into my beekeeper suit, but it wasn't trying to stop me. I looked down and could see a hand holding my arm, but not trying to freeze it. My eyes followed the arm up to the body of the yokai that was in the process of pulling itself together. The torso and head began to form together as though drifts of smoke were pulling themselves together. The body of the young woman began to form next to me, and I looked at her slender form reach to the ground, forming pelvis and legs. As the wisp condensed along enough to become solid, almost like skin, her face became very clear. Her eyes are still darker than the night without a moon, but there was something about the way she presented them. There wasn't any sadness that I could see emanating from her eyes, nor was there fear. What did come out was concern. I looked into those eyes as her long black hair began to flow down her back, and that perfect kimono formed around her body. Those eyes seemed to look into my soul as though they were concerned about my safety. With her newly formed second arm, she raised her hand and pointed into the distance. I turned and looked at what she was pointing at, and my blood ran cold for a totally different reason. Standing about 70 meters away, perfectly still, was a man-shaped form with an elk like a head. The body blended in so well with the surroundings that I was having trouble focusing on it. I didn't see any eyes, but it seemed to be looking right at me. And when the snow woman whispered something I did not understand in Japanese in my ear, I could barely speak her language, so I looked at her confused. That's when she began to show fear in her eyes. When I turned back to that thing, it wasn't there, not where I had seen it before. It was gone. I pulled up my pistol and cocked the hammer back as I looked around. Not seeing anything, I looked for the snow woman. She was gone too, though I could still feel an unnatural chill in the air. Shaking off the experience, I continued to walk to the beehives, this time with my pistol up and ready. Though as I walked, I realized how pointless it would be to use a pistol. If I was right, that creature was a Wendigo. I had never seen one before, so I wasn't sure. Enough strange things have happened in the past few years that I'm just kind of losing track. The fact with the Wendigo is kinetic force doesn't do much at all to them, aside from making them very angry. The best I could hope for was the specialized bullets that might hurt this thing as they burned and make it go away. Normally, the only thing I can take out a Wendigo is fire. Never thought I would regret not smoking. Opening up the hives, I could see that the remaining broods were doing just fine. With the daffodils coming into full bloom, they should be able to kick the season off right. I had to place my pistol on top of one of the hives to open the others, though I did keep it within arm's reach, just as habit and training dictated to me. On my way to the second hive, I reached for my pistol so I could move it. It wasn't there. I looked over and the damn Wendigo was standing next to the hive, holding my pistol. It wasn't holding it correctly, but instead it held it like a child trying to figure out how something works. I stood there, frozen in fear, at this 8.5-foot tall creature examining my .45. Eventually, it must have gotten bored as it dropped the pistol to the ground and reached out for me. Still in shock, I stood there as its long, rotting arms reached out for me. When it reached for me, it sank its claws deep into my shoulders and began to growl. It bared several layers of teeth before opening its massive mouth full of broken and jagged teeth. That was when a blast of cold hit the side of my face so hard it was like somebody had slapped me. The Wendigo seemed to feel the same thing as it shook its head like a horse trying to shake off flies. I realized what was going on, and I knew I only had a moment to act. I grabbed the closest hive and used all my strength to rip the top of the top of the bee box, off of the hive and hit the Wendigo with an uppercut of honeybees. I got more of it in its face as the top two supers didn't separate due to being glued together with wax. The supers broke apart from the force of the strike against the Wendigo's jaw, however, and within seconds the air was just full of bees. The Wendigo let go of me and staggered back as it seemed to be trying to keep the bees out of the holes it calls eyes. With all the force it could muster, I charged at the Wendigo, hitting it near its waist and pushing it into another hive as it toppled over. With that, the air became alive with very, very pissed off bees, all of them wanting a piece of whatever had broken their hives. I was still in my suit, so they couldn't get me, but I could hear them hitting the veil with so much force that it sounded like heavy rain. As I struggled to my feet, the Wendigo continued to thrash on the ground. I have no idea if bee venom would kill it, but I had an idea that it didn't feel good at all, the way he was kicking and screaming. After all, you don't have to be allergic to die from 2,000 bee stings. Scrambling, I felt something hard under my leg. Reaching back, I grabbed my pistol off the ground and tried to get my fingers in place. The heavy gloves needed to open the bees made it nearly impossible to get my finger inside the trigger well. As I maneuvered my hands, the damn thing misfired, the recoil nearly knocking the pistol out of my hands, but I was able to adjust enough that I had a firm grip on the handle. The Wendigo was still thrashing on the ground as it tried to bury its face into the dirt, trying to keep the bees out of its skull. I aimed for the back of its head and began to place round after round into it, each of them finding its mark into the back of the bastard's head. It screamed in pain, but I'm sure it was just the heat of the bullets that made it hurt. It turned over and swung at me with its massive arms. I'm sure it was out of desperation since it didn't land a solid hit, but it hit hard enough to send me to the ground. As I got to my feet, I looked to see that my suit was torn. Though I'm not allergic to bees, the air was thick with the nasty buzzing around, as they angrily tried to get at me. The Wendigo must have been gutting through the pain of the stings as it got up and began to come at me. I tried to fire again, but the magazine ran dry. When I raised its hands as though it was ready to crush me to the ground, the Yuka-onna formed right in front of it with her arms open as though to protect me. The Wendigo didn't hesitate and tried to crush her, but when she moved in time for it to miss, she didn't see the leg shoot out like a donkey to kick her into a large oak tree. At that moment, I saw her body fall limp to the ground, and something in me snapped. Grabbing the closest thing I could, which was just a simple stick, I drove at the Wendigo and stabbed it into the neck. Without a second thought, it tossed me off like a bug on its shoulder. I landed rather hard and rolled to a stop. As I was getting to my feet, I could see the Wendigo coming to finish me off. It didn't get the chance. In a moment, the two succubi were on top of it, fully into their monster forms and tearing into it, their large claws tearing huge portions of the rotting flesh off the Wendigo as it roared and thrashed at them. My guardian was grabbed by the leg and thrown to the ground while her sister tore apart its back. The masses of congealed blood and rotten flesh began getting thrown around the trees. My guardian was hardly phased from the throw and was back up in a second. The only thing that seemed to slow them down was the bees still trying to sting everything that was still moving. Finally, they each got a hold of an arm and ripped it clean from the Wendigo's body as they braced their feet against it and pulled with all they could. It was still thrashing in pain as my guardian began to pull its head off while her sister ripped open its chest. I could hear the neck breaking as I got to my feet, but that was nothing to the sight of the large succubus ripping out its still beating heart and holding it to the sky. She then screamed out some sort of incarnation, and the heart burst into flames, and the Wendigo went limp. The girls looked and saw I was having trouble staying on my feet as I walked to them. They came to me and see if I was all right. They kept having to flinch from the stings that were still coming around. I told them to get away from the hives, and the bees will just leave them alone. Pointing to the stream, I told them, I will meet you over there. Just hurry up and scrape off those stingers. As they began to leave, I added, don't pinch them, scrape. I would have to explain later, but I had more pressing concerns. Stumbling over to the Yuki-onna, the yokai that had helped me out, I found her passed out next to the tree. Due to the suit, I couldn't tell if she was cold, but I could see that she was bleeding. The hoof of the Wendigo was like a dull spear into her guts. Even though it wasn't bleeding much, it was enough to make me concerned. The back of her head was bleeding as well from the impact. Most likely, the impact against the tree had just scraped her up, but I couldn't see any broken skull. Quickly, I picked her up and rushed her down the hill to the girls as they tried to use the water to cool off the bee stings. I suddenly found myself hoping they were not allergic. When I got to them, I asked them to take the Yuki-onna into the house. They looked at me like I just asked a fish to tap dance. I told them that she had saved my life and that the Wendigo would have ended me if she hadn't helped. They looked at each other for a moment, and then they took her. Using that teleportation, they got in within a few seconds, and I could finally stop. I dropped to my knees and puked right through my veil. Not only was my adrenaline wearing off, but my suit had been torn open in several legs, the largest one on the back of me. The sensation of over 100 bee stings flooded my body, feeling like acid burning its way through my veins. Though I'm not allergic, there's only so many the human body can take. Struggling to take my suit off, my vision began to get strange. I knew what that meant. The concentration of venom had reached to my brain. Thankfully, I know how to adjust my body chemistry to compensate, at least for a while. In truth, a lot of people do know how to do this, even if they don't realize it. The side effect is the massive headache you get later. But for now, I just need to stay awake. Slowly getting to my feet, I found that I didn't break any bones, but I wasn't going to be dancing anytime soon. I did find myself thanking God that I remembered to drive the ATV instead of walking. I'm not sure if I would have made it if that was the case. Leaving my equipment, I jumped on the ATV and made my best speed to the house. I took a deep breath and composed myself before I walked in the door. In the living room, there were the sisters standing over the snow woman. They had removed her kimono, and I could see the extent of her injuries. Aside from an obvious concussion, at least 2 of her ribs were broken. Putting my hand over the top, I could feel that they were cracked, but not fully splintered. Unfortunately, this was beyond my level of medical knowledge, so I called up my sister who worked in the medical field and asked her if she could come over. Even though she was busy, she made time, but it would be a while. During that hour and a half, I kept checking her vitals. Everything I picked up from all my time in the service came in handy, though I wouldn't have to worry if she would just wake up. Why? Well, while we waited, the sisters told me of how a Yuki-onna works. While moving about, they can change their form from human form to beast form to straight cold air. Normally, they hide in snowstorms because once they choose a physical form, they're subject to physical law, at least for the most part. You see, mortality is a choice for them as far as aging goes. This is why the same beautiful young woman is seen throughout the centuries. Looking at her face and body, I could see why anyone would be attracted to her. By the way, never let a succubus notice you checking out another girl. Being slapped on the shoulder of one thing, being slapped with a clawed hand is completely another one altogether. When my sister arrived, she was surprised that there was another succubus in the house, though she was a little bit more put back by the lack of clothing on either one of them. When she started checking out the snow woman, she made a remark about me having a harem, and I was quick to snap, "This ain't some anime." I got my sisters to simultaneously ask, "Anime?" I told them that I would show them later. For right now, we need to know how our new arrival is doing. As it turns out, not so bad. The ribs were cracked, but there is no internal bleeding. The bump on the head wasn't anything but a bump on the head. Aside from that, all she really needed was some time to heal, so we very carefully moved her into one of the beds of the spare room. I made sure her kimono was washed and hung up so she could put it on easily. I doubted we needed to do much more except check her from time to time. I gave that job to the two sisters. I had a mess to clean up. After putting on my spare bee suit, it was time to clean up after dancing with that monster. While trying to wrangle the bees, I found out that I had lost another entire hive, and a second one might make it if we're lucky. Thankfully, the rest were untouched. The Wendigo body had to be dragged into the fire pit so it could be burned, which I did gladly. I was beyond sore at this time. All the equipment was accounted for, cleaned, and put away, along with cleaning up the area of all the remnants of the Wendigo. I didn't know much about them at all, and I may be going beyond my requirements, but I really don't care. It was past sundown when I finally got back to the house. The sisters had made dinner for us, and we were able to talk about the day's events. As we talked, I began to try and put the pieces together, but they didn't make sense. Things like, what is a Japanese demon doing in the U.S.? Or how about why a Wendigo is now smoldering in the fire pit when it's on the wrong side of the country? These questions continued to burn in my mind as I took a shower to clean all the extra junk off my body, mostly blade stingers. When I came out into the living room, I could hear a large thump coming. I was like, now what? As it turned out, good news. As it turned out, the Yuki-onna had awoken, but she had woken with such a start that she had fallen out of bed. I kind of chuckled at this. We all went in to help her out, and I thanked her with everything I could about her help. She never did answer me in English on why she helped me out. It was strange. It's legend that they don't really help out many people. In fact, usually they hurt more than they help. But I think the fact that the two standing behind me in full demonic form made her a little nervous. I remember standing up, helping her to her feet, and then she realized she was not wearing anything. I reached over for the kimono as she covered herself, held it out for her, and put it on. I took as much care as possible, continuing to thank her, and of course my guardian thanked her as well, as she was not around, and she would have failed at her mission had the Yuki-onna not shown up. I did ask for her real name, but she was not willing to give it. I simply told her, "You have sanctuary here. You are safe here if you ever wish." She simply grinned, so I knew she understood everything I said. I walked her to the door, and as she left through the threshold, she again turned into a wisp of cold air that simply went off into the ether. I turned around, and I could see jealousy in the eyes of the two succubi that were there. Well, I looked them square in the eye and realized I only had one option. "Girls, it's getting a little too busy here. Tell you what, switch back to human form. Get your bags. We're going on vacation. We'll come back once everything's calmed down. And then maybe, just maybe, we can have a little more fun. But for right now, I just got one question. You girls ever been to a water park?"